Hi there, I'm Matt Bachle, and welcome to the Digital for Good podcast. On this episode, I chat with Ruth Muller. With 26 years experience in R&D and marketing for large FMCG multinationals, Ruth is now transitioning to join a high-growth founder-led company to work across operations, HR, and AI enablement. It's a fascinating conversation with Ruth, discussing the changes to the working landscape that AI are bringing, but also the opportunities and opportunity for innovation. There's lots of interesting things to take away, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. I know you and I, Ruth, have spoken about it a lot in the past, but I'm really keen to hear your views on that idea of how, the changes that we're all feeling with AI and the impact on how we do work, but how to actually set up organizations to do that successfully.
Yeah, well, I guess there's so much changing in the world at the moment and it's all just moving so fast. And nobody really has all the answers with AI because it's all so new. And I think a lot of the time people are going in and looking at current processes and looking at the ways they're doing things and saying, how can you add AI on top of that? And they're sort of taking a point solution approach to it. But then often what you're doing is there's a lot of waste in the system that doesn't need to happen now because you have the ability to do things completely differently. So I think if you can understand how you can look at the system as a whole and how you might do it differently.
Yeah. I think we found that as well. When we first started to kind of use and lean on AI at Grade, is we were using it to sort of fix discrete small parts of the process, because that sort of felt, I guess, almost the easier way to do it. Hit an issue. Can AI make this better? Can we automate this? And it felt like it was effective. But really, it wasn't looking at that overarching concept and actually thinking, how do you look at it as a whole system? And I think we've still not got that right. But yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying, where you kind of need to take it from that sort of top overview as opposed to fixing or improving small parts of the process or the system.
Yeah, I think a key thing is firstly making sure everything's grounded in your strategy. So knowing what you're trying to achieve at a high level, but then understanding what the outputs are or the outcomes. So rather than thinking, here's a process that I currently have, how do I execute that process differently with AI? If you actually say, well, just park the process for a while and think about the outcome you're trying to achieve, and then think, how might I do that differently with AI? So, for example, you might have a really complicated artwork process that's involving a lot of people. And rather than saying, how do I streamline that process? You might say, what are you trying to achieve? Which might be compliant artwork. And then you say, with digital tools, with permanent employees, with fractional staff, or with partners, how might I actually rethink how that gets done? And you just design it in a different way.
Yeah, and I guess are there challenges that you've seen, which is not only is it, how do you kind of implement those changes down into an organization, but also to the sort of top levels of organizations? Like, I'd assume it's really important to get that, CEO level buy-in into that organizational change.
Well, I think the tricky thing is the way this works best is if you can invest the time up front in re-looking at your systems. But the challenge is that everybody's so busy and you've got so many examples of this. So I think a lot of the way we approach this is we say, okay, what are the use cases? And we try and get people to come up with these. And sometimes it might be people within the IT department coming from the place of these are technologies we're seeing. Or sometimes it might be going out to the business and saying, what are your needs? And I think there's definitely value in that. But the challenge, there's so many challenges which go beyond the technology here.
Yeah.
And I guess one of them is if you're able to identify what it is that you want to achieve, sometimes it's not just about the AI platforms. It's also about your entire data architecture and the tech stack that you currently have and how it works together. Like even just an at-home example is I was using N8N to build a workflow, and then you figure out, well, actually, I could just do that with Claude without even using it in N8N. So what's the best way of achieving things? So I think just, what are the platforms that we're currently using in the organization and where is your data sitting and how are you accessing that data? And often some of the biggest challenges are things like, the data security and APIs and how you get it all linking together and being able to access the data you need. Or you might find that you don't have the data that you need in order to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So it almost requires you to look at it at a holistic level and then to sort of start to design what the future state might look like, and then work backwards and think, okay, well, what are some of the things I can quickly do now? And what are the things that might require a bit of a sequence? And I think there's even some times where you're going to have to let go of legacy systems that you might have invested a bit in, or even, the way that you've structured things that you might have put a big investment in the past. There's actually a completely different way to do it that doesn't require that, and that can be hard to let go. So I think there's a lot of challenges in that area. And then I guess even just from a people perspective and a change perspective, it's so new and it's so scary, and everybody thinks that they're behind on AI. So whether you're sort of at the pinnacle of use or whether you're really quite new, you always think you're behind, because if you are using it quite a bit, you're seeing what all the possibilities are and you're comparing yourself to that. So I think it's a time where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of messiness, and there's no right answers at the moment.
Yeah. And I think the sort of negative impact on jobs that AI has had, I think people were and still are feeling quite sensitive to that. It's pretty much every other week there's mass layoffs, blaming AI. And I think for people to trust maybe that an organization is trying to, lean into using AI in a positive way and to, increase output, not necessarily reduce headcount, or work in a more efficient way or a more interesting way, and allow individuals to be working on the high value work is a really important thing to make sure people understand.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's gonna come full circle, and you're already starting to see it, right?
Yeah.
So, we have a talent shortage, and we will continue to have a talent shortage. And I know, this has been a very real thing for a lot of people. So you can't deny that AI is taking people's jobs. And I guess a lot of people are saying, well, we don't need software engineers now because AI can do it. But on the other hand, have you ever, as a non-technical person, have you ever tried to do this stuff without a software engineering background? It's actually really, really hard just to get the systems talking to each other. So I actually think that to even if you can get Claude to do a lot of the coding for you, to actually know how it works and to be intuitive in that way is going to be extremely valuable, because you're going to be able to troubleshoot the issues so much easier, because a lot of the time you spend with Claude trying to program something at the moment is actually figuring out why it's not working and doing the debugging.
Totally.
And engineers are going to just know that so much more intuitively than layman people.
And like you mentioned before about choosing which systems to use, it feels so easy to flick between different LMs or different tools or different systems, because they're designed to be sort of easy to use initially. But then you do often get to a point where, like you said, you're hitting roadblocks and you may have selected the wrong tool for that job. So that idea of engineers or technical people, their value, like you said, lies in a slightly different way. It's not necessarily writing hundreds of lines of code. It's architecturing and integrating, bashing out thousands of lines of code every week.
Yeah, I think every role is going to have a link to tech in the future, or even not far in the future now. So I guess if you think of a demand planner, for example, it's not just about the functional expertise of demand planning, it's how you use that with data and analytics and building models and coding. So if you might have a demand planner and a software engineer, and if you put them together, they're going to be able to 10x what either of them would be able to do without each other. So I think that, you've got all these people with these skills that are being let go from the tech companies. And I guess my vision would be, for FMCG, can they pick up these people with those skills, bring them in with the experts, and then between them, they figure out a better way of doing it? I feel like it will come full circle where people will realize that we need people. there is a talent shortage, and there always will be a talent shortage, and people will become the bottleneck, because what you're doing is, things are moving so fast now that you need to spend that time up front figuring out what you want to do. Like, I've had so many times where I've gotten really excited and I've jumped into building something, and then it's like, I should have done this, and I should have done this, and I should have done this.
Yep.
And by the time I've wasted so many tokens and had to increase my subscription about 2 or 3 times, if I had have just sat there in the first place and figured out, like, spent the time designing it and figuring out exactly what I wanted to do, which actually requires a level of contextual understanding, right? And expertise of knowing what you need to do. If I had spent my time doing that up front instead of getting so excited, I could have actually built the thing with much fewer tokens. And I think that's a very real challenge at the moment. Like, if you apply that to enterprise, like, everyone's getting so excited that they're jumping in. Like, everyone across the organization is like, oh wow, I can do this and this and this and this and this. And then next thing you know it, you've got this huge bill. So I think this thing of FinOps is becoming really important, where we need to make sure we spend the time up front figuring out what we want to do before we execute it, because the execution becomes so fast. And then you need to work out what to do and then have the right people who can support on that. So I think ultimately the jobs will change quite dramatically, but we're still going to need people, because the people need to tell the AI what to do. They need to sort of build the contextual elements, and then there's the human element.
It's exacerbated something in the sort of digital industry that we've felt for years, which is people want to skip the scoping phase. In traditional projects, it was, we need to scope. And it was like, can't we just start? Can't we just start designing or building straight away? And that was in the old days where that build and design process would take a long period of time. So now all it's done is made that even more acute when people try and say, can't we just start?
Yeah.
Not if it's vibe coding, but can't we just start prototyping straight away? And it's like, there is an argument that because it's so easy to prototype and iterate now, that is where the scoping work happens. I'm not sure if I agree with that, because like you said, I think you need to force yourself to pause, interrogate why you're doing something, who it's for, what the outcome needs to be, because without that well thought out information, you're running blind, and you're then making decisions on how to change a prototype or iterate without really knowing what it's based on. And so, sort of first principles thinking, it's that traditional, what's the plan, who's it for, and then start. And then, yes, you can then iterate during the process, which was always the case. We receive, briefs effectively from current or future clients that are very much, ChatGPT outputs with some quite detailed requests in there. And then you start to pick it apart and then question it. And actually they weren't important. They were just the nature of a non-technical person having a chat with Claude or ChatGPT, and it's we have to sort of push back even harder than we used to on those sort of situations.
Yeah, well, I guess when you can collapse the execution time of something, it makes so much more sense to scope it out properly up front. I mean, this is just what I've constantly found, is that by not investing time up front, I'm wasting so much more time and also money down the track. So I think it's really important. And it is important to kind of have those conversations between technical and non-technical people, and to understand what is it that you're trying to achieve, and then what's it going to take to get that. And then again, you need to get back to your fundamentals and get that right, because, it will all come down to like the quality of data and the quality of inputs.
Yeah. And, like getting people in a room together early on, as someone who's been so pro remote work for 15 years, I'm seeing the value of getting in the room together at the start of a piece of work and really sort of interrogating and pushing and discussing and challenging what you're trying to do early on, because otherwise, you can go off and end up in such a sort of silo of, I'm doing my work with Claude or whatever, and then someone else is doing theirs, and it can very, very quickly go off on big tangents because it's sort of easy to.
Yeah, definitely. You could end up having people across the organization solving the same problems in different ways, or you
Yeah.
could have things that are happening which should be interdependent and connecting that are happening independently. So I do think if you sort of step back and you look at what you're trying to achieve as an organization, if you're building an AI strategy, I do think it's really important to look across the system rather than
Yeah.
just looking at it through a siloed lens, because there's a lot of things that you'll just be able to eliminate right up front rather than fixing. And for the things that you are fixing, it's understanding, it's investing that time up front to
Yeah.
figure out what's the best way of doing this.
Yeah, and giving that sort of whole organization view. I've spoken about risk before as well, and that idea of how to manage risk and how to have the right kind of framework and guardrails so that people in the organization can experiment to a point and understand, I guess, where those kind of levels are. And if you're not looking at it as a whole organization, like you said, they're just going to be going off and making decisions and doing things that are too risky for the business.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a few things that are going to become even more important in
Mm,
organizations with the acceleration we're getting here. And one of them is around decision making. We need to
yeah.
rethink how we do that. One of them is learning and building capability, and one is risk. And risk management is something I've always been quite passionate about. So when I was at Unilever in the early days, we had a guy from the Netherlands come over and give us like a week-long training program on risk management. And you'd think it would be boring, but I was just so engaged in it the whole time. And I guess what it made me realize,
Yeah.
because I'm a person who pushes the boundaries, I'm an innovator. So you'd sort of think, well, I might not like risk, but what risk allows, if you can understand what your risks are, you can actually push the boundaries further. So
Yeah.
if you can actually step back and articulate, firstly, I guess these are the outcomes that I'm trying to achieve. And then you say, okay, what might go wrong?
Yeah.
And then what's your worst case scenario? Then you can decide what your risk appetite is, and you can decide how far you want to push that based on what the consequences are. And then you can actually go further. But I think if you just close your eyes to that, you have the
Mm,
potential for fallout and for issues to arise that are massively accelerated. And then you're sort of trying to claw back, on your response to that. And if you can think about that up front and think about that early, then I feel like you can push the boundaries sooner. And, if you sort of think of decision making, the reason decision making is becoming so important is because, the timeline for execution is collapsing as a result of that. And it's going to get even faster once, quantum computing comes in. Be it 10 years or 20 years, we need to start changing our mindsets and the way we operate now, because it's going to take that long to change the
yep.
human stuff, but things will just be so fast. So if you can spend the time up front thinking about what decision should we be making and what's the basis for that decision, and then what's the risk associated, and just sort of being deliberate about some of these things, because you're getting data that can help you make decisions, but is that the right data? So I'm sort of thinking about decision making in terms of, like, firstly, the availability of relevant data, and then secondly, the uncertainty of the situation you're
Yep.
in. So you might have really good data and you might have a fairly certain situation. So this might be something like, forecasting on your core SKUs of your business. You've got really good data and it should be fairly stable. So
Yep.
in that case, you can use your data for decision making, and you can sort of take that management science approach. But if you're in a situation where either you don't have the data, or your data is historical and it's not reflective of what the future is going to look like, and you're in a highly uncertain, unstable environment, then
Yeah.
applying that management science thinking to that decision making is not appropriate. You're going to end up probably in a worse place than if you didn't use the data, because you have the wrong data. So that's where you need to sort of be making hypotheses and testing and pivoting and iterating. So I think if you can look at, think about what the decision making requires, and then think about the risk associated with that, and then what level of risk are you willing to take. I think that's going to be a game changer in terms of being able to get to the best outcomes for your strategy.
Yeah, and educating people on how to work within that all as well. Like, it's so, as an individual, it feels like we were talking about, so easy, using LLMs to make decisions and trial things and kind of end up with things that you feel are quite final, but you need to sort of be trained and a framework provided so you know how far you can take things. When I use LLMs, I know that I need to question the output. I know, that I should not take everything as gospel. But you find yourself, because of the way the interfaces are designed, feeling like you've worked something out and you've cracked it. And it's sort of for you to go back and say, actually, this is too far, or I've gone too far with this. I've prompted too much, and we've ended up down a pathway that actually, is too risky or doesn't, align with the strategy. You have to, I constantly have to remind myself to do that and to bring myself back a little bit, because it just feels so easy. And, I'm a business owner and we're a small business, but you imagine that if there's thousands of employees all feeling that as well, can be quite, too risky.
Yeah. And I guess it's just understanding maybe there is more that you do with AI, but then there's just the judgment and the checks that you need to put in. So, you're still leveraging that, but making sure that you're doing the appropriate human checks at the right time.
Yeah. Which from the change in org structures is a really interesting challenge. What are the reporting lines for that kind of process? Because it's different. It's a sort of slightly different version of, checking things in with your boss. It's actually a systems change.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I think the other thing is when human judgment is so important now, but who's got the judgment for that particular decision or that particular risk? So it might be that traditionally things might have just elevated up the chains, and ultimately, there might be a decision that gets to the executive team and they might be making it, but they may not actually have the right judgment or the right context or knowledge to be able to make that decision. So sometimes people at the front line might have more accurate, the human judgment side of it, the experience side of it. Sometimes there might be people other than the exec team that might have that. So I guess when you're sort of looking at this decision making and risk, how you do that, thinking where you do need that human judgment piece in addition to the the predictive tools of the data. Where do you find that judgment? Who is best placed to be able to apply that judgment to get the best outcomes?
Yeah. How is it earned and how do you quantify it? And then how do you operationalize that? It's a really interesting, challenging, especially for bigger organizations. It's hard enough with small teams. And so you multiply that by 100 times. That's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I think an example of that is, many decades ago, we used to have this thing where we said it's the chairman's wife's decision on what you launch for the consumer. So ultimately, if you prototype a product and then somehow it gets in the hands of the chairman's wife and they don't like it, and they tell the chairman, and then the chairman says, oh no, we don't like this formulation direction, we like that formulation direction. Whereas the people who really, really understand the consumers are often in a very different place to that. So you can get a decision based on, what the formulation should be from someone who's actually not the target. And their view may not be relevant as to whether that's going to be successful in market. And it's a similar thing across the organization is, who should actually be best placed to be making those decisions and who has the best judgment.
Yeah, love that. I've not heard of that phrase before, but it's I've seen that hundreds of times over the years. From a technical point of view, what system should we use, and it ends up being something that someone senior used once and liked, and that ends up being the decision. So you get that applied to CMS choices, or if it's iOS or Android, if you can only do one for an app, like we've seen that a lot over the years. We always used to say, and we still do when we're in the early stages of a project and they might bring together some of the senior people from the client into the room to kick things off. We often say if they've got, let's say they've got a phone customer support team, can we have someone from that team join the initial planning as well? Because they're the ones frontline dealing with, frustrated customers calling. They're the ones who are dealing with little workarounds that they've had to do over the years because systems aren't quite right. So that sort of idea of getting someone who maybe isn't senior, but probably has the most relevant understanding of the challenges or the issues is hugely valuable.
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, in a world where we have so much access to data and so much ability for advanced analytics, you would think that data would be even more important. But I'm a big believer in judgment and instincts because data's, if it's historical data and it's looking forward and the situation looking forward is unpredictable, then sometimes the data might not be as relevant as what people give it credit for, which can be dangerous. So I think there's a risk of relying too much on data. And I mean, judgment and instincts feels like it's sort of a magic fluffy thing that doesn't have any substance. But the reason you have instincts is because you've had so much data, not necessarily quantitative, but qualitative data going in for so many years, and you've seen these types of things happen before. And sometimes if you're in a highly volatile, highly uncertain area, then the instincts does have a significant role to play, but it's just really about understanding the situation you're in and what you need to rely more heavily on. So for people who are experiencing things day in, day out in their day job, they probably do have some real good input in terms of making decisions to solve for some of those problems.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and judgment, instinct, it's up there with creativity for me as well. It's like how can you look at things in an unusual, creative way that hits the mark? It's going to be interesting in a few years' time because you build up instinct and judgment and creativity, I think, by being in the trenches and making decisions and making the wrong decisions sometimes and learning as you go. And I think with the sort of the newer members of the workforce relying on AI a lot, it's going to be interesting to see how they build up that muscle over the years.
I think a lot of people do talk about, the younger people entering the workforce now and have that, they won't sort of have those entry level roles where you learn so much. But again, I don't know if I'm just like an optimist, but I don't worry about that either because I feel like they won't have our learning that we had in that way, but the jobs are going to be so different that I think they'll still have their school of hard knocks or whatever you call it, but it'll just be in a completely different way.
Totally.
So the entry level jobs will still be there. They'll just be really different. But I also think that it's important when you're thinking about your organizational design and your operating model and how things get done to look at the role of people with expertise and people that are new. And by the way, these guys are these people are digital natives. They're they've got things that are heaps more amazing than some of the things the expert has. Like when I'm watching my daughter, she types so fast and her brain moves so fast, I can't even keep up with her because it's just such a speed. So it's like if you put those two people together, if you put an expert together with a digital native and they can learn off each other, that's awesome. Put a software engineer together with a traditional functional expert, they'll learn off each other. So you got to sort of break down these silos and get people cross-fertilizing. And I think if you can set up your organization in a good way, then bring in lots of recent graduates and let them learn, but they're going to be learning different things and in different ways.
Even I fall back into that slightly traditional way of thinking. It's like, and you're right to point that all out. It's just different. It was different when I joined the workforce to when my dad joined the workforce. Didn't mean I didn't learn things or learn by experience or make mistakes. They were just very different type of day-to-day work. You look at sort of 20-somethings entering the workforce now, they operate in just a very different way, even to our age, which is not that much older, really. So it's changing so fast. It's going to be an interesting few years for sure on that front. There used to be a thing that we would talk about is you want to hire lazy software engineers. But the reason you say that is you want someone who's always looking for the most efficient way to do something, sort of reusing things where they can. And I guess it's just another version of that. It's people using tools and their day-to-day is just very different. So they're creating efficiencies and moving the type of work they do around. My day was spent, and I'm sure you did in corporate land, your day is spent in emails, or what did you achieve today? Nothing. I just dealt with lots of emails. Some of them might have been high value, but a lot of that is just getting yourself through the day working in a big team. And that's not valuable. That's not pushing things forward particularly. That's just administration, really.
You really can make a huge difference in terms of efficiency where, I sat down to do something recently that took me half a day and previously it would have taken me 2 weeks. So, you've got that computational power and it's that significant. But I think ultimately a lot of people look at AI enablement at the moment in terms of efficiency. And I think, that is there and it's something to consider. But if you've got 2 people doing a job and you think, okay, well, now that I've got AI, I can have one person in the AI and do the same job. Well, what if you look at it differently and think, okay, well, I'll keep the same 2 people and I'll just 10x my outputs. And there's actually a productivity increase rather than just an efficiency piece. And I think that the opportunity for efficiency with AI is there, absolutely. But the productivity and the value and the growth that you can get. So this is one part. And yes, we need to look at that as a hygiene factor. But if you start to say, what can I imagine? Like if I think about my strategy, what's something that would allow me to deliver on that in a new and different way that I wasn't previously able to do, that allows me to really 10x those outputs? I feel like that's where the true value comes from. Yeah. And I think the gap between people thinking differently and using it in different ways and people not leveraging it is just going to be so significant. And then you'll see a real difference in terms of business performance. Like, the barriers for building a business have come down now. I've sort of been spending a lot of time with founders and startups recently, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but if you want to do something now, you can. It's getting so much easier. And I think that whilst there's such a big percentages of small businesses and startups that aren't successful, the ability to be able to scale something quickly and create value is so much easier than it used to be. So I think that if large companies are not finding ways to do things differently and moving with pace, then, you've seen what has happened with Blockbuster and Kodak, and that seems to be like a very extreme example. But I feel like there'll be so much more of that because the ability for small businesses to be able to scale rapidly is so much more open now that we have these tools in place. So it's going to be a funny period of time over the next decade or so because everyone's figuring it out. It's kind of like this messy middle piece, like, when electricity was first invented and it's like, great, wow, everyone's going to have power. And then 20 years later, hardly anybody was using electricity. And 20 years later, it was then in like 50% of households or something. So it kind of was a 40-year period in the messy middle of trying to figure it all out before it actually got to the point of it being commonplace, because everybody had like these big steam engines that were powering their factory. So it wasn't just about a point solution of how I fix this. It's how do I change the entire system in order to get that working? So it's like, this is the biggest technology change that we've ever seen in our lifetime. And it's not like this is just going to happen and then it'll slow down again. It's just going to keep building. So this period right now is just going to be really messy while people figure it out. And then it'll get to a point where we do, like, there's all these learnings you're starting to see now that you could kind of see it coming, like the fact that AI is being subsidized and the fact that people are not realizing the cost of that. And then now people are starting to realize, and then, not just the cost for you as an individual or a business, but also from an environmental perspective. Like, I just read The Empire of AI and it kind of freaked me out a bit. So I just, like, for me now, I'm just like so conscious. I don't want to use AI for anything that's not actually adding value because I'm so conscious of the environmental impact. So I think that's a learning that's only sort of come about to most people fairly recently, the environmental impact, the FinOps side of it. And then, there'll be all these learnings that we take, but we're just still figuring it all out and nobody's got all the answers. Yeah, thanks.